Former Kansas City Police Department intelligence detective and now attorney Gary Jenkins produced 4 documentary films, most recently Gangland Wire, creator of smartphone app entitled Kansas City Mob Tours. Download it now. If you like what you hear, go to ganglandwire.com. Navigate to the shop page. We need you to put a hit out on our donate button. Gangland Wire True Crime Stories is produced at the Big Dumb Fun Show Studio 4. And now, here's Gary Jenkins.
Thanks, Aaron. Welcome, everybody. And when you listen to this online a week or two from now, this is the first live recording of our podcast. And I think I hear a phone.
Yeah, it's my phone.
As a reminder, everybody, please turn your phones to stun or vibrate.
Yeah, there you go.
Mr. O'Malley. Anyhow, well, that lightened me up
Mark
a little bit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We Aaron and I have been doing this for almost, about 8 or 9 months now.
8 or 9 months now.
I've got about 20 episodes online.
And I'm almost no more familiar with all of the characters than we started.
Well,
because there's so many of them and it's so confusing sometimes.
We just keep telling other stories. My co-host, every time I do this, is Aaron Gnurk here. He has the Big Dumb Fun Show internet radio show every Monday night. Go ahead, tell them a little bit
from 7
about
to 10 p.m. Central Standard Time. It's just independent, unsigned music and trending talk topics.
So we use his studio to record this, and Terrence has been on the show twice. We did 2 shows on the Union Station Massacre. And so you can go online, go to my website, ganglandwire.com. I've got them all uploaded there. If you want to subscribe to the through your iPhone or your Android, go to the podcast app and open it up and search for Gangland Wire. Don't go any further than Gangland Wire. I found out it will act like it's not there, but if you just type in Gangland Wire, you'll find it. You can subscribe, so you'll automatically get a new episode every time I put one up. And if you happen to do that, or you already subscribed and you've never given me a review, give me a review. The more reviews you get, the higher up you go in the search engine stuff. And so we want more people to find it. We're trying to reach out to other cities, and I've gotten downloads from all over the United States and from New Zealand, Australia, England.
You said almost 10,000 downloads
I've
so
got
far.
about 10,000 right now. So,
which isn't really any compared to some of the other larger
Well, yeah, they'll
podcasts.
get
But I
100.
mean, you've been doing it for 8 months.
right, and we don't have we don't have the NPR budget behind this, do we, Aaron?
No.
So anyhow,
But we have some of the talent. I
we have
think.
some of the talent.
For
Oh, yeah,
sure.
I forgot. With Aaron, Terrence is here tonight. He's
Yeah.
the NPR talent tonight. Anyhow, so we're going to talk about the mob and the politician, and we're going to start back. Terrence tells me even before the 30s. Terrence has done a couple, 3 films. He's done the mob and the Black Hand Straw Man, which is a story of the mob in Kansas City, a documentary. Mine's more about the 70s and the River Key, Gangland Wire. His was about the mob starting in the turn of the century in the Black Hand days. And so tell them what else you've done.
Okay. Well, let's see. I did Nellie Dawn, which is both a book and a film, and I released that in 2006 here in Kansas City. And it was while I was doing Nellie Dawn. For those of you that really don't know the story of Nellie Dawn, she was the largest dress manufacturer in the history of the world, basically. They made 75 million dresses here in Kansas City. And she was kidnapped in 1931 and held a ransom. And she was rescued by the mafia. And so it was while I was doing the research on that piece of it that I started to realize, wow, nobody's ever given a decent treatment to our esteemed mafia here in Kansas City. And so I set forth on starting the research for my film, Black Hand Straw Man, The History of Organized Crime in Kansas City, which basically covers from 1910 to 1986. And the name comes from Black Hand, which is the early extortionary period of Sicilian upon Sicilian crime in Kansas City up to the 1980s straw man, which is the FBI code name for the investigation into the skimming of the casinos in Las Vegas. So it's kind of, if you will, temporal bookends is what the title's all about. And while I was doing that, Union Station caught on to the fact that I was researching a film on organized crime, and so they asked me to direct their film celebrating, or at least recognizing, the 75th anniversary of the Kansas City Union Station massacre. And I cut a deal with them. I said, any research that I do for your film, I get to include in my film. And they were perfectly fine with that. So I managed to get a little financing for my film out of Union Station.
Which is hard to get, financing for film.
Yeah, for documentary films. And then it was interesting, after I released Black Hand Straw Man, Butch Rigby, who is the proprietor of the Screenland Theaters here in Kansas City, put his arm around me and he said, "I got your next movie for you." And I said, "What's that?" And he goes, "Tom and Harry." And I said, "Yeah, I like that." And Tom and Harry is, it's called Tom and Harry, the Boss and the President, which is about the relationship between Tom Pendergast and Harry Truman. And I always go further and tell people it really is the definitive film about the Pendergast machine, because my feeling about it is that if you did not understand what the Pendergast machine was, there's no way you could understand why Harry Truman had that undying fealty to the machine. And also when national biographers or storytellers come to Kansas City to talk about Harry Truman, they do not have the breadth of time or the depth of space to commit to telling what the machine really was all about. And so I felt like it was really important that my film be really the definitive film and stand for a long time as the definitive film about the Pendergast machine.
Cool. And one more thing, he's getting ready to do Nellie Don the musical, which sounds most interesting to me.
Yeah.
I don't know how that's going to work, but he's going to do it. He's a musician. He plays every Friday night at O'Malley's.
At Conroy's on 95th Street.
95th.
Yeah.
Well, and we were listening to some of your music before the program before we came in here, and I think interestingly enough, not only are you going to be doing a musical, you're an author because you have a book that complements Nellie Don as well as Black Hand Straw Man movies.
Yes, absolutely. Right. They're both books, and so they're films, they're books. And, people ask me, what am I doing all the time? I'm collaborated with a very talented guy. He was most recently, he was the musical director out at the New Theater restaurant for the Addams Family, and now he's on tour with the National Touring Company of Ragtime here, and so he and I are planning on filing our Nellie Don the musical copyright as of July 1st, 2016, and next year it'll be the 100-year anniversary of Nellie Don, so expect a big musical to come out of Kansas City about Nellie Don.
Cool.
And her story is pretty amazing. That's all
you are an interesting guy. All right, let's.
That must have been because Tom Pendergast, the musical, a little harder to do.
Yeah. Tom and Harry singing.
Yeah.
Harry could play the piano.
Yeah, I can't imagine him, Tom Pendergast, doing a soft shoe,
but
maybe
do the soft shoe and sing.
Yeah.
Harry can certainly play the piano. Anyhow, I keep turning away from the mic. I know I shouldn't do that.
That's all right.
So let's start talking about our topic tonight, and the topic is about the mob and the politicians in Jackson County and Kansas City, and we certainly have been affected by that. And Terrence, I was figuring we'd start in the 30s with Pendergast, but Terrence wants to start a little bit earlier. So
well, again, it goes back to one of these things that I feel like people need to have the background to understand why these political events were allowed to occur the way that they did. And so really what I do is I take it right back to the 19th century or right around to the turn of the century. And that is in 1900, it was finally the Irish Catholic community in Kansas City took political control of the city. It had been a long time coming. Pretty much this city had been run by kind of the Republican gentrified aristocracy, if you will. Every now and again you'd see some inroads made by some ethnic groups, but for the most part, It was very much just a very white and Protestant type of political community here in Kansas City.
In English,
Yeah.
English, not Irish, English.
In English, Anglo, and nothing. That's the way it was in lots of cities. But so what happened was, Big Jim Pendergast, he comes down. He's the oldest of 9 children from St. Joseph, Missouri. He comes down and he's working in a foundry, and he's working various jobs here in Kansas City. And then he wagers on a horse race, and he wins a big ticket on a horse called Climax. So he takes the money that he wins from that gambling event, and he opens up a bar and a hotel, restaurant, saloon down in the West Bottoms, which he calls, of course, Climax. And that really is the beginning of the Pendergast machine, because Big Jim Pendergast was this very garrulous character. He was very warm, very welcoming. He empathized with the downtrodden. And so his saloon and his bar kind of became a meeting place for the common workers. And you have to appreciate that Kansas City at this time, the commerce center of Kansas City was the West Bottoms. The industrial center was the West Bottoms. That's where the rail depot was in the West Bottoms. And so Jim Pendergast became very popular. He ran as an alderman in Kansas City in 1892, and he held that position for 18 years till 1910. Now, you have to appreciate Kansas City at this time was under a political structure where there were basically 32 aldermen. You had an upper house and a lower house. And so Big Jim, by dispensing favors to the people that came to his saloon, like he would do things like cash their paychecks for them. And of course, be more than happy to serve them some drinks too while he was at it. But he would lend them money, and also a new family would move in. They'd make sure that they got coal and that they got food and that they were set up with some place to live. And so it was just kind of this little bit of a social program. So Big Jim becomes very popular, and by 1900, he puts together a coalition of German Catholics, Croatian Catholics, Italian Catholics, Irish Catholics, and they are finally able to pull together, and for the first time, they take control of the mayor's office, and they install as mayor a guy who is infamous in Kansas City history named James A. Reed. And it's James A. Reed's first political office. He had been the local prosecutor here and had actually had never lost a case, and he prosecuted the son of Jesse James.
And that go way back.
Yeah, that's one case that he lost. Well, anyway, so one of James A. Reed's first acts was to appoint Big Jim's little brother, Tom Pendergast, as superintendent of streets. Okay. And for any of you who know anything about the Pendergast history, asphalt kind of plays a big part of the Pendergast history. And that's where Tom learned about paving and concrete and how to let projects go, how the system worked. And so...
Well, that was because he actually worked with his dad, right?
Well, he worked...
under his father?
No, Tom Pendergast was the younger brother of Jim Pendergast, and Jim Pendergast was an alderman. Tom became superintendent of streets. James A. Reed was mayor of Kansas City. So that's how and also at that point in time, 1900, the Italians all became Democrats in Kansas City. Okay? I mean, before they hadn't really necessarily had any particular political affiliation, but Big Jim Pendergast was able to corral them. And you have to appreciate we had a big Little Italy here in Kansas City because many Italians that came over from Sicilia, they came from New Orleans up the Mississippi River and then over on the Missouri, and they would stop and get off, and there were a lot of jobs here in Kansas City. So they populated what we now know as Little Italy here in Kansas City. And so it was the first time that the Italians really got political. And they were organized by a guy named Joe D'Amico, or Joe D'Amico, as certain people will call him. And the D'Amico family's still here in town. And so that's the way it was. You had the Irish faction take control of the city, and then there was a division within the Irish Democratic factions. You may have heard of the Goats and the Rabbits, because Joe Shannon was another Irish leader here in Kansas City. He had control over the Rabbits. Pendergast had control over the Goats. And the reason why they're called Goats and Rabbits is the Goats were supposedly fast at getting to the polls. They would scurry from one place to the next and vote here, and then scurry over there and vote there. And then the Pendergast Goats were known because of the cud chewers that resided in many of the Irish shanty homes along the hillside there of the West Side Bluffs of Kansas City. And so when they started calling Pendergast people nothing but a bunch of goats, the Pendergasts embraced it and said, yeah, we'll be goats. We like that. That's okay. So you had these two different political factions, and they had an agreement. They called it the 50-50 agreement, which was basically that that no matter who got elected into office, they would hire the Democrats from either faction. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it was in place for 20 years. And that, of course, included the Italians. And so the Italians voted religiously for the next 26 years, Democrat in Kansas City. It really didn't question it. You could always count on the Italian vote. But what happened was that the second generation of Italians was starting to happen in Kansas City. And so you had younger American Italians now living in Kansas City who they were desirous of having political control of their own district. And this would have been the Little Italy section, which basically I'm going to define Little Italy in Kansas City as Independence Avenue on the south side, Grand Avenue on the west side, the river on the north side, and then going over to, like, say, Lydia or Tracy on the
really,
east side.
Like all of Columbus Park,
Yeah.
and large part of the Northeast.
Right, absolutely. So that was what we would call Little Italy. And so at that time, though, Pendergast had a political club there in Little Italy, and it was run by a guy named Mike Ross. And Mike Ross was a absentee political boss because he lived in the south part of the city. But he would go down into Little Italy and operate his political club. And so in the election of 1928, it was a municipal election, a young man came up through the ranks, and basically they kidnapped 4 Pendergast poll workers in 1928.
Let me play a little clip from your movie.
Okay.
Play that Pendergast Lazia 1. It's a man named John Lazia started coming in.
Tom's control over Kansas City was unparalleled,
at that
and
time.
yet more power was on its way, along with some alliances that were unsavory, to say the least. Specifically, organized crime insinuated itself into the machine in the form of Johnny Lazia, boss of the North Side Italians and the front man for Kansas City's sinister mafia. On May 8th, 1928, Kansas City held a bond election, a fairly routine event. Lazia thugs kidnapped 4 Pendergast poll workers and held them hostage for the day. Lazia demanded of Pendergast that the North Side Italians in the First Ward be given home rule, control of Democratic political activities there, and that Johnny Lazia be their leader. And so it was. Johnny Lazia basically had his henchmen put guns to the heads of these Pendergast poll workers, and he told Pendergast, he said, we're going to kill these guys if you don't give me political control. I want to be made the political boss. And at first Pendergast balked, and then he said, okay, well, why don't we do this as a compromise? Why don't we have 2 clubs? I'll have my club, you have your club. And Lazia refused to accept that because they just thought that, it wouldn't work. And here's the deal, and this is something that, I hope everybody here appreciates, is that Tom Pendergast could not go to war with the Italians. You could not do that. The Italians were armed. Tom Pendergast never ordered a hit on anybody. He was not a godfather. He was not a participant in organized crime in a classic mafia sense. He was a political boss. He was a private businessman by this point and time in his life. And so he could not start an armed conflict with the Italians. And so he basically capitulated, and he said, fine, you can have your own club. And the Italians were loyal Democrats. They never said that we're going to defect from you as a political boss, but we want to be able to run our own political district. And so as a result of that, what happened was that Pendergast then, as of that moment, really was in bed with organized crime in Kansas City. Now, don't think that Tom Pendergast was some type of saint. He started cheating when his brother retired in 1910. Tom took over his alderman's seat and sat there for 6 years and realized that he could be a lot more effective by not being a politician and being essentially manacled with all of the ethics and all of the restrictions that politicians have. He'd better off being a private businessman who got the right people into power. And so Pendergast cheated at the polls constantly. He'd do whatever it took to win at the polls. And that included hiring thugs to beat people up when they went to vote. He was famous for hiring a guy named Solly Wiseman, who was this, I call him the mastodon gangster. He's 6'3", 320 pounds. This big Jewish gangster, just a mean son of a gun. They used to call him Cut Your Head Off Solly, the terror of 12th Street. And he was just a big, mean guy. And he would go, and if somebody thought that they were going to vote Republican at the polls in Kansas City, they got the bejesus beat out of them. And then there would be lots of times there would be fights at the polling places in Kansas City between the various Democratic factions.
And the police never did anything about this?
The police were, how shall we say, reactive.
They showed up after the fact.
Which kind of brings us to the next topic, is taking control of the city and the police department.
Well, yeah.
Let's play that Pendergast Lazia 2. That's
The state-run KC Police Board was ruled unconstitutional because it delegated to the police board the right to tax without representation by setting its own budgets. That decision put police operations directly under the control of the Pendergast machine. McElroy pushed through the selection of former used car salesman and friend of Johnny Lazia, Eugene C. Reppert, as director of Kansas City Police, who quickly announced that his department would concentrate on suppression of major crimes and the cultivation of polite manners among traffic cops.
Now Lazia, he actually had an office, I understand, down in police headquarters.
Well, it was said, and this probably happened, but then it got blown out of proportion. But it was said that if you called down to police headquarters, Johnny Lazia was just as likely to answer the telephone as a cop was.
We found a letter that said, "Okay, John Lazia, on a hire for the police department, was going to be a photographer that wanted a job for the police department." The letter said somebody was a good Democrat, which meant he voted the right way, and it said, "Okay, John Lazia."
Yeah. So, he had way too much influence on our Kansas City constabulary. As a matter of fact, there's a statistic. At that time, we had about 700 policemen, and at least 70 of them had felony arrest records and had served time and had been convicted for felonies. So, and the other thing is the Pendergast machine purposely paid the police very, very poorly so that they would take bribes. They had to buy their own uniforms, their own billy clubs, their own guns, their own handcuffs, their own uniforms. And then they had to pay a cut off of their salaries to the machine. And so all of this created an environment of corruption. And the Pendergast philosophy was that the rich men and the rich people have their clubs that they get to go to and their bars where they get to hang out and smoke cigars and drink, and nobody bothers them. Why shouldn't the common man have those types of vices as well? And so there was just kind of a nod, wink attitude toward things like prostitution, gambling, alcohol distribution, you name it. They were pretty much into it. And then Tom Pendergast benefited from all of this because he took a cut off of all of the sin businesses, and he literally at 1908 Main Street would have bags of money delivered to his office there by the members of the organized criminal society. And so we're thinking, well, okay, let's get this back around to politics, right? Because frankly, that's what Pendergast was all about.
Well, they're doling out jobs to these various people, be they in the police department or their contracts for city work, and they had a lot of power and control with the money there. And how did this work with Vice when wasn't this during the time of Prohibition?
Oh, yeah, Prohibition. What a humorous notion that was in Kansas City. The only people that were busting people in Kansas City for Prohibition were the feds. And they simply did not have enough manpower to enforce Prohibition. And Kansas City, under Tom Pendergast, the police, that was one of the things. You could bribe the policeman if you were a bar owner or you were running, some type of liquor distribution or gambling operation. You could bribe the police. They would take the bribe because they needed the money so desperately, and they would basically leave you alone. And it's very evident that this is true because this is how we became a crucible of jazz here in Kansas City, is because we had this real kind of, a wild nightlife atmosphere where the clubs and the saloons and the bars and the speakeasies and everything are staying open real late. And so jazz musicians all flocked to Kansas City because there were jobs to be had here. And that's how, and so that's one of the better byproducts of the Pendergast machine here.
Interesting that jazz came out of that.
It is. They never could have predicted it. And Tom Pendergast himself wasn't a particular jazz aficionado or anything like that. It just is something that resulted.
But it sold a lot of liquor.
That's all, yeah.
A lot of liquor, yeah.
And interestingly enough, the Mutual Musicians Foundation, the only establishment in Missouri with a liquor license now that they've been granted by the state, it's still like 5 a.m. because of that historic fact.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that. Interesting.
Yeah, it is. And they're doing recordings there every Saturday night now. So, yeah, it's great. Well, so anyway.
So tell about a little bit about the reform movement. There was the bloodiest election ever.
Well, okay, so.
What, 1934?
Yeah, 1934. So basically our political system was out of control. In 1934, we had the bloody election of 1934, where 4 people were killed at the polls, and dozens of people, if not scores of them, were sent to the hospital with having been beaten and bruised and
because they voted Republican.
Yeah, and just because they were part of 1934, there was a little bit of a movement of reform. To go to a cleaner form of government, and so anybody who was openly in favor of that would, of course, get the heck beaten out of them at the polls. So it was a terribly violent day. It was one black precinct officer was killed. And the really interesting thing about it is the corruption wasn't just with the police, but it went into the prosecutor's office as well. Because the prosecutors here in Kansas City purposely fumbled and bungled and just screwed up criminal prosecutions of guys where the evidence was overwhelmingly against these criminals, and yet they would purposely lose evidence or not introduce evidence or not call witnesses, or sometimes witnesses got killed.
That was just because of the corruption.
Yeah, because of the corruption. And they couldn't, you couldn't enter into a deal with the devil, i.e. the gangsters, and then expect them to abide by the deal if your prosecutors are putting them behind bars. And so the prosecutor's office was rife with unethical conduct. And there's some guys, particularly W.W. Graves comes to mind as one of the most salient violators of all of this. But so that was 1934. In 1936, the feds are starting to really catch on to Pendergast. And I might also, this is kind of an interesting story. People don't realize this historical fact. But in 1934, when Harry Truman was finishing up his second term as the presiding judge of the administrative court that handed out the construction contracts here in Kansas City, he didn't have a job. He didn't know what he was going to do. And so, in this roundabout way, Pendergast was encouraged to put Harry Truman up as a candidate for the U.S. Senate. Harry Truman wanted to be the tax collector. He never had any thought of being a United States senator, but his buddy from World War I, Jim Pendergast, the nephew of Tom, who served with him, he and his dad, and there's a bunch of Pendergasts. So Mike Pendergast and Jim Pendergast, the nephew, went to Tom Pendergast and said, "We think you ought to run Harry Truman. We'll put the money up to begin with, $500 each if you'll do the rest." And Pendergast said, "That guy's nothing but a bankrupt haberdasher." And they said, "Nah, he's a mason and he's a farmer and he's got a lot of good things going for him." So Tom Pendergast said, "Okay, you guys each put up $500. I'll bankroll the rest of it." That's 1934. So Harry Truman runs for office in 1934, and he is running against a guy from St. Louis named John Cochran. And Cochran is a congressman, and he's a very strong congressman, and he's a Democrat. And then he's running against another guy from Missouri named Tuck Milligan. And they were both running on an anti-Pendergast platform. And so Cochran made the mistake of saying, "Well, I got to get 120,000 votes out of St. Louis." So that told Pendergast, "Oh, well, if he's going to get 120,000 votes out of St. Louis, I got to make sure Kansas City produces more votes than that." So Harry Truman got elected into office with at least 60,000 ghost votes, fraudulent votes.
Was Kansas City as large or larger than St. Louis at that time in
No,
1936?
I don't think so. I don't have I don't know exactly what the populations were, but
Didn't matter.
well, because Tom had his number. He knew he had to make, and so he got something like 126,000 votes here in Kansas City. Kansas City at this point in time also had a voting ratio of like 98%. In other words,
That's pretty good.
yeah, that's pretty good.
Everybody but the disabled.
Yeah, and
Some of them.
they had these different ways they cheated. They had pad spooks, sleepers, cemetery commuters. All
This is what they would call them.
yeah, right. Oh, yeah. And each of them had a different role. I mean, one thing is they'd take derelicts and they'd line them up outside and they'd have them vote, and then they'd drive them somewhere else and line them up and have them vote. And then, of course, they had, names and roles that were just padded with fictitious names. I mean, they would find a place, say at, 9th and Walnut with, 75 people living there. It was just nonsense. It was totally bogus. But so keep that in mind. So you had this guy Cochran and Tuck Milligan who split the anti-Pendergast vote, so they siphoned votes away from each other, and then Tom Pendergast delivered 60,000 plus fraudulent votes to Harry Truman, which is why when Harry Truman got to the United States Senate, he was known as the senator from Pendergast. They said his ears were calloused from taking so many orders over the phone from Tom Pendergast. He was senator non grata. He really was reviled when he first got there because nobody took him seriously because they didn't think he had any legitimacy.
Well, do you think that maybe Tom Pendergast did that because he wanted political power in D.C., or do you think maybe the position of the tax collector was so important they didn't want to give it to somebody as honest as Harry Truman?
Well, both. They
Good
didn't give it to
question.
anybody honest, and he had already promised it to somebody else. And yes, he wanted power in D.C., and he had already wrapped up all of the representatives because in the 1932 election, the Missouri governor, who was a Republican, he vetoed the redistricting legislation. And so what had happened was everybody who was running for Congress had to run at large. So if you were running for Congress in Missouri in 1932 and you were from Joplin, say, well, you were getting voted on by people from Kansas City, St. Louis, Cape Girardeau, where have you, and vice versa. If you're running in St. Louis, you're getting voted on by people. And it was a complete, utter political blunder for this Republican governor to veto this legislation. And as a result, who else in the state can deliver 100,000 votes? No questions asked. And that's why you had so many politicians trundling up the stairs there at 1908 Main Street paying homage to Tom Pendergast because they needed his votes. So in 1932, he got 12 out of the 13 congressmen from the Missouri delegation elected. So he already had a lot of political power in D.C.
because of that.
Which is very important because 32 is also when Roosevelt came into power, and he made a deal with Roosevelt. This was what I mean. Harry Truman said Tom Pendergast was the most brilliant politician he ever met. He could see things in advance and get things done to set it up to his benefit in the future to come.
But he wasn't a politician. He's played it behind the scenes.
Always behind the scenes. And so at the 1932 Democratic Convention, it was fascinating because James A. Reed, by this time, was an elder statesman. He'd already married Nellie Don by this time, and they were up at the convention in Chicago in 1932. And Pendergast said, well, I'm going to throw my support behind our native son here, James A. Reed. You all can do whatever you want to do, but I'm going to support James A. Reed for president, right? Well, Reed had no chance in the world of getting the presidency, but it was a statement. So at first, they had 3 rounds of votes, and at first, the Missouri delegation, most of them voted for James A. Reed. And Tom said, no, you can vote for whoever you want. So the next time round, a bunch of them siphoned off and voted for Roosevelt. So the third time round, all of them siphoned off and voted for Roosevelt except Pendergast. And he voted for James A. Reed. And so the Roosevelt people were so impressed with Pendergast's control over the Missouri delegation, they made a deal right then and there that all of the New Deal money for like the WPA and everything would flow through Kansas City. And that all of the jobs and everything that resulted from that would be distributed and would be decided out of Kansas City.
For the whole U.S.?
Well, for all of Missouri.
Oh,
each state got a delegation. And so Tom Pendergast basically at that point in time had control over 80,000 jobs in the state of Missouri. Now, this is how you become a political boss. You don't just wake up one day and pound your chest and say, I'm the guy. You lay the foundation. You do things like you get congressmen elected. You get in on the money that's going to be distributed. You get your guy to be a senator.
You get jobs to your state.
Right. You get jobs. Jobs. And that's what Harry Truman was most loyal about. Harry Truman's philosophy was, to the victor go the spoils. And he was all about giving jobs to Democrats. He had no problem with that whatsoever. And I'm sure you guys have all heard Tom Pendergast had his coded system where, if somebody was red, go ahead and hire him. If you wrote a note, if somebody was if it was in red ink, go ahead and hire him. If it was in blue ink, it was, well, let's wait and check this guy out. And if it was in black ink, it was like, don't hire him under any circumstances. So, they had this real kind of system in which Pendergast would dole out jobs and people would line up around Pendergast headquarters there at 1908 Main Street and wait for hours and hours for a political favor.
This was probably almost at the height of the Depression, though.
Oh, it was totally. In the
it
middle
was like
of
the social net. They didn't have welfare. You had to get a job, and he was a social net of the day in the
absolutely
Depression, wasn't he?
Yeah, and is a kind of a rustic form of welfare. So in 1936, the elections roll around, and the feds know that the Pendergast machine's going to cheat. This is what they do. And so they waited. They couldn't make any arrests before the election, so they waited for the election to occur, and then they pounced on them. And they indicted 287 people here in Kansas City for vote fraud. And they convicted 259 of them. And approximately 80 of them actually went to prison and served jail time. Now, I kind of laugh at our modern political circumstances.
Where was Chris Kobach?
Well, just think he would have been like orgiastic, getting to prosecute all of this wonderful vote fraud,
Real vote fraud.
Yeah, real vote fraud.
In the whole scheme of things, 250, 260 people, probably not very many compared to how many went around for him doing fraudulent voting over the years.
And that's a fair statement. But what they were like housewives, and they were grandmothers, and they were
doing hard
college students, and they were just everyday people from all walks of life who were trying to curry favor with the local precinct captain to show, look how well I cheat. Make sure Boss Tom hears about it, and because they want to get Tom's favor, but they couldn't get to Boss Tom because by this point in time he was way up here, and he had everybody else just working for his organization. And so when the prosecutions were occurring after the 1936 election, Harry Truman stood up on the Senate floor in Washington, D.C., and he said that a Democrat in Kansas City could no more get a fair trial than a Trotsky follower in Soviet Russia or a Jew in Nazi Germany. And he sat down, and all the other senators just looked at him with, incredulity and were.
That's how he got into office.
Well, yeah, that's how he got into office, was through fraudulent votes. But also, at that point in time, because of the harsh reception by everybody, the national media, everybody, and including our own media here. The Kansas City Star and the Times were operating, and then there was the Journal, and there were quite a few newspapers here in Kansas City. And, they pretty much roundly decried Harry Truman's speech on the floor. And Harry thought his career was over at that moment. I mean, he thought he was done. Mm-hmm. He actually wrote a friend of his and said, I probably won't be running for office again because I just screwed myself because I stood up in support of Tom Pendergast. Well, so the 1940 election rolls around. And this is why I asked you, just keep in mind that name, Tuck Milligan. Because when Harry ran for office in 1940, he was challenged by the new governor of Alaska, Guy Pendergast had supported Harry, had helped put into office, a guy named Lloyd Crow Stark. And he owned a nursery of apples. He was a very wealthy man. He owned an apple orchard, a national apple orchard in Louisiana, Missouri. As a matter of fact, he invented some types of apples. I don't know if they're Jonathan apples or, but he's very famous for having invented these apples, mm-hmm. right? He used to hand out apples when he would campaign. So that was the governor, and he had gone to Roosevelt and said, you need to investigate Pendergast's fraudulent voting. Well, so he started taking credit for putting Pendergast behind bars, because in 1940, Pendergast went down. They got him on a conviction of a non-declaration of income for taxes. And so this guy, Lloyd Crow Stark, the governor of Missouri, he's running around and he's kind of beating his chest saying, I'm the guy that put Pendergast behind bars. Well, the local U.S. attorney who actually did the work and did put Pendergast behind bars, he took umbrage at this and he said, I'm not going to give you all the credit for that. I'm getting in the race. And so they had the two guys that were the anti-Pendergast candidates, constantly, beating up on Harry Truman about Pendergast, because Pendergast's sitting up in prison at Leavenworth while Harry's trying to run for re-election, and Harry has no money. Mm-hmm. And all his friends said, don't run, you can't win. And Harry said, well, I got to run because I could never face my people back home if I don't. And so it looked really bad for Harry. And this is, again, this kind of goes to the point that when the national media comes in town to do a story on Harry Truman, they don't spend the depth of detail to understand what was going on in that 1940 election, because it was local politics, but it was very serious local politics. Well, anyway, so remember I told you to remember that name, Tuck Milligan, from 1934? Well, the U.S. attorney who prosecuted Tom Pendergast was Maurice Milligan, Tuck's little brother. And so what happened? When Maurice Milligan entered the race, it split the anti-Pendergast vote on the Democratic side, and Harry Truman won with a 1% plurality. Wow. To go back to the United States Senate. And wags often say that every day that Harry Truman got up, he should have gotten down on his knees and said a little prayer for the Milligan brothers.
Well, you would think that they did this in 1936, that the same thing would have happened again in 1940 when they have two anti-Pendergast guys running against each other.
Yeah, and that's when. So Harry got elected in 34, and they got reelected in 1940. Yeah, and then he went on. And then he went on to make his political bones, so to speak, with the
he did
Truman Committee,
anti-corruption.
Yeah,
war crime. Well, yeah, war corruption.
How ironic is that really? The guy who was like involved in a major political corrupt machine really? Would be the guy that would out corruption really? In the letting of contracts during the war.
And if you interview any old World War II vets that were alive and in Europe at the end of the war and ask them about Harry Truman, they'll say Harry Truman saved my life. And by
dropping the bomb.
It was just, there was those guys, they love Harry Truman.
Yeah. Now I want to say something though before we jump too far ahead, is that during the 1930s, all throughout the 1930s, the organized crime was right there in the thick of fixing elections. The Italians had everything to gain by keeping the Pendergast machine in power, because that was their allied, so to speak. And so they were during the 1936 trials, the vote fraud trials. the federal judges were receiving calls from clearly mafioso here in Kansas City who were threatening to kill them and threatening to take care of business on their own, and that they'll get their own justice and stuff like that. So there was a lot of intimidation that was going on with the participation of the mob here in Kansas City.
So let's skip forward. We're going to kind of take a break. We try to cut these down, and we're going to do 2 episodes. But let's talk a little bit about the murder of the 2 Charlies, because this was after the war.
Yes.
And these 2 men, Charlie Banaggio and Charlie Gargata, had taken money and made promises that they could deliver a mob-friendly police board back in Kansas City, and they didn't get it done. And what's really interesting, this is what's the name of the Democratic Club? It was at Truman and Charlotte.
It was that precinct's Democratic Club.
What was that, Chris?
First District.
First District.
I was thinking maybe third, but yeah.
First District Democratic Club about Truman and Charlotte, which there's freeway and parking lot there now. But the picture of Harry Truman looking out over this scene is priceless. So let's talk about that a little bit, the 2 Charlies and who they were. And
Sure. So the prelude to this particular murder, which if you go to the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, which I would recommend everybody do, it's fascinating.
It's really good.
Yeah, and you make your way up the museum into the courtroom where they held the Kefauver hearings in Las Vegas, and they show a film, and the first murder they start with in the film is this murder right here, because it had such national ramifications in terms of the mafia. And so really the genesis of it is that Harry Truman is now president of the United States in 1946, and he has become disillusioned with this local congressman named Roger Slaughter, who has been opposing Harry in some employment legislation that Harry's been promoting. And so Harry calls his good buddy Jim Pendergast, Tom Pendergast's nephew, Jim Pendergast, with whom he served in World War I, and he calls Jim Pendergast and he says, I want this SOB purged. And that's the exact language he used. I want this son of a bitch purged. I don't want this guy in Congress anymore. How dare he defy me in my own district, in my own city, while I'm the president of the United States. I want this guy out of here. Well, that was kind of like a call to arms, so to speak, because, by this time there had been the sweep of city politics, and the Pendergast machine was basically marginalized, I guess might be a way to put it. They weren't nearly as strong as they had been. But so Jim Pendergast then approaches Charlie Banaggio, who is the titular head of the mafia in Kansas City. And of course, you have to understand Kansas City's mob culture is that they like to put guys out front that were ostensibly the head of the mob, when the old Black-Hander guys, the Mustache Pete guys, were actually
Tano Lococo and those guys were behind them.
Absolutely, they were
still in the background pulling the strings.
The strings and deciding how things would work. That's kind of a roundabout way, but it really underscores the relationship between the mob and Kansas City and at a presidential level, because what happened was Big Jim Pendergast, he hooks up with Charlie Banaggio, and they managed to have another corrupt primary election in 1946, and they oust Roger Slaughter. They get rid of him. And, of course, the Kansas City Star immediately cries foul, and various Republican factions cry foul, and they convene a grand jury, and they start conducting hearings. And this is all proceeding. They've got indictments pending. And then in April of 1947, I believe it's April, men snuck into the Jackson County Courthouse right there at 12th and Oak Street, and using nitroglycerin, they blew open a vault and stole all the voting records that were the evidence in the case. And as a result, I think they got a couple of Snag Klein, I think got convicted, but they only got just a couple of convictions. They had 59 indictments outstanding, and they had to dismiss all these indictments. And the irony of it is that Truman's candidate lost in the November general election. So not only did he purge Roger Slaughter, a Democrat, he put a Republican in his place for Kansas City. So,
Do you think that was because of what happened with the voter
Yes,
fraud and,
absolutely.
At the Jackson County Courthouse?
yeah. Well,
Did they ever find out who did that?
no.
No.
Well, I mean, yes, but you know.
I mean, not that they knew, or they suspected, but they never
Charlie
had-
Banaggio was behind it 100%. I mean, they just knew because Charlie Banaggio was an active political campaigner. He used to drive through the streets of Little Italy and on the northeast side with a loudspeaker truck, and and be handing out pamphlets. He was an active pamphleteer, a campaigner. They actually came to calling him judge. And so he was very engaged politically. And so leading up to this, to what's going to happen here in 1950, Charlie Banaggio strikes a deal with the National Syndicate, with Costello's people in New York, and with some mob syndicate people in St. Louis. And he says, if you give me a bunch of money, I will make sure that the right politicians get elected so that we can open up Missouri to gambling. We'll all make a bunch of money because we'll control the gambling in Missouri. And so he did that for the 1948 election. And but he got people elected, but they weren't willing to just universally, just sponsor legislation because there was not otherwise political will to have gambling in Missouri. And so as a result, Charlie Banaggio could not come through on his promises. And so Charlie Banaggio at this point in time, and things are heating up for him because he's getting pressure because now he doesn't have the money to pay back to the National Syndicate for his campaign activities, right, for his promises. And so what happens is that, and also you have to understand that Charlie Banaggio is the co-owner, they had to murder the guy to take ownership, but they owned the club called The Last Chance right down there. If you go to, where WDAF is, right there on 31st Street, well, if you take that street right on down to Southwest Trafficway, there's a Quick Trip right there. Well, just about maybe 100 feet over is the actual state line divide in Kansas City between Kansas and Missouri. So there used to be this saloon there, and it's called The Last Chance. This is back in the 1950s. It had a different name during Pendergast era, but so they actually had a diagonal line drawn across the floor at this saloon, and so when the Missouri cops would come to raid the place, they'd move all the gambling equipment over to the Missouri side. And then when the Kansas cops came to raid the place, they'd move all the equipment over to the Missouri side. And this went on for ages. Well, so it's 1950. I'm going to say April 5th, 1950, if you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on that date. But so Charlie Banaggio gets driven down to the Last Chance Saloon, which he owns with Gaetano Lococo. He owns with Charlie Gargata, and I think maybe the guy up north, his name I forget. Anyway, he owned a golf club or something. Anyway,
John Patrick Goulding, didn't he?
Was
he the owner
Goulding.
Of that?
Yeah, I believe that's the guy they killed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
To
He
take
had
the
it
ownership
before,
of it,
okay.
right? So anyway,
Eddie Spitz, Eddie O'Shea.
yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
from
Eddie
Mirror Lake
Spitz.
Country Club.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or Osachi or something.
I
Anyway,
always
however
call
you
it
pronounce
O'Shea,
it.
but-
Yeah. So they all own this club now, and Charlie Banaggio goes down there to the club one midweek evening, and he meets up with Charlie Gargata. Now, Charlie Gargata is really one of the very bad boys of Kansas City Mafia history. It was an executioner, was one of Johnny Lazia's henchmen. He was involved in the big shootout on Armour Boulevard with Sheriff Bash. He killed a lot of people here in Kansas City. Was an unapologetic mafioso. And so he was Charlie Banaggio's, one of Charlie Banaggio's, capos, if you will. And so they have this hushed meeting at the Last Chance Saloon, and then they go over to the First Ward Democratic headquarters to meet somebody. And, not sure what happened, but they come to find Charlie Banaggio there lying in his own pool of blood the next day with 3 shots in the back of his head and 1 through his left eye. And then they found Charlie. That's Charlie Gargata. Then they found Charlie Benaggio leaning back in his chair. He too had several shots into the back of his head and 1 through his left eye. And that shot through the left eye is a mafia calling card, which basically sends the message that this was a professional hit. And secondly, it disfigures the corpse so they can't have an open casket. And interestingly enough, they buried both of those gentlemen out of Holy Rosary Church down there, 5th and Holmes, I think it is. And they, Benaggio's funeral was huge.
Lazzie is also...
Yeah, he was buried out of there. There's a lot of people buried out of that church.
All the mob funerals were held at
Holy Rosary.
And they're all buried at St. Mary's at 22nd and Cleveland.
That's right, exactly right.
And all the ones that disappeared, they're buried somewhere else.
Well, we don't know where they are.
Okay, but they're not in Brush Creek.
We did find that out.
Right. Just disabuse yourself of this notion that there's bodies lying underneath Brush Creek. It's not true. Tom Pendergast did not order hits on people.
The 2 Charlies, they were essentially executed, and what you're suggesting or saying is that this was done by the other families from the other cities as retribution for not delivering gambling in Missouri.
Well, now this is why, Gary and I and other people here ought to get together, because they will not give access to the investigation files of these unsolved murders. The Kansas City Police Department will.
Right. Any unsolved murder, you can't get to the file. Even though it's long since dead, everybody involved, they won't let you see them.
And I think that's a ridiculous policy, because clearly they're not working the cases anymore.
Clearly.
And, people could unearth, historians could unearth things that they might find in the file that might shed some more light on the situation.
Now there is speculation.
Oh, there's a ton of speculation.
Nick Savella had been in trouble with the local mafia, and he'd been robbing some protected games, and he had ran to Chicago and hid out, and they brokered a deal for him to come back about this time.
That's right.
And then these murders happen, and Nick Savella then goes on to be the driver for the who was the boss at the time, a guy named Tony Gizzo, and this is like 1949, 1950, and throughout the 50s, and by 1957, Nick Savella is now named the boss of Kansas City at the Appalachian Convention in New York, introduced to all the families in the United States.
And it's
Kansas City.
It's pretty much presumed by people that Gary, you worked with, and other people I've talked with, that is probably how Nick Savella made his bones.
Right.
This is how you make your bones in the mafia. You do something big. And it's interesting, Gargata and Gaetano Lococo, there used to be a restaurant in downtown Kansas City called Gaetano's for years, and that's who it was named after. And Gargata and Gaetano Lococo, their relationship was, I think, that their wives were sisters or something like that. And for years, there was intra-family tension because, the one section of the family knew that the other one had killed the other one, had, basically participated in the killing. I mean, they think that Gaetano Lococo probably was...
He would have been the one that ordered it.
Yeah, at least ordered it.
If he would have had to approve it. You don't do a hit like this without approval. In this case, all the way to New York City.
Right.
You just don't do a hit like this.
And also, it makes sense that it was done by Kansas City mobsters,
sure.
Because Kansas City had a reputation for taking care of its own. It didn't need outside people to come and perform its executions. They had plenty of talent here to do that.
Well, I was going to just interject into this, that having done these episodes with Gary, he would say, and had said in the past, he would listen to some of the other episodes, that they would get a trusted friend to get them alone, or we ran into Terrence O'Malley. Let's all go have a beer.
Yeah, these guys were meeting somebody that they trusted. Because they wouldn't
go there alone like that.
His name was Nino, Pete Nino, not Pete Nino. One of them had a bodyguard named Nino.
Oh, no. You're thinking of Nick Penna.
Oh, Nick Penna.
Yeah.
And they left him at the last chance, and they went up there alone. And there was really no signs of struggle. One guy, as you can see, was killed, and he's still sitting in his chair. and maybe Gargano would try to get out the front door.
Yeah, they think that Gargata had made a run for it after they shot Binaggio first, and then they turned to shoot Gargata, and they think that Gargata made it as far as the door, and he grasped at the door, which is why the blinds to the door were disheveled. And then, when he got shot, he spun around, just spun onto the floor. And
they didn't walk in there without their bodyguard unless they were really comfortable. So it had to
with
be
whoever it is that they were
it had
there
to be
with.
somebody that set them up.
I think it's just fascinating, though, that they couldn't even eulogize Charlie Gargata. There was nothing really good to say about the guy. I mean, Binaggio at least was perceived as a guy who was trying to shake things up on the political front.
All right. Well, let's wind down since we're going to tape this. I mean, we're taping this rather, and we're going to play this one. And I always do a public service announcement for my favorite nonprofit, First Call. If you have a loved one, an employee, a friend, a mother, sister, son, father, grandfather who has a problem with addiction to drugs, alcohol, gambling, any kind of addiction, why make First Call your first call. It's 816-361-5900, and they have a website, don't they, Aaron?
It's firstcallkc.org.
Yeah, www.firstcallkc.org. So having said that,
do we want to take a 5-minute break to let people use the restroom?
Yeah, let's take a 5 minute. Okay, good
so
idea.
we will give you guys a few minutes here. We will come back and we will start all over again with the second half of Gangland Wire Crime Stories.
Get a beer, too.